Professor Savage, it is great to be with you again, particularly as we discuss this matter of religious liberty, especially during the antebellum period. But before we begin, could you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Absolutely, Reverend Kelly. My name is Audra Savage. I am assistant professor at Wake Forest University School of Law. I research in the area of race and racism, specifically focusing on law and religion. I've also done some work in corporate law as well, and I teach business law and corporate law classes, as well as race and law.
Great, thank you.
And how about you, Reverend Kelly?
Yes. Well, I am Kelly Brown Douglas, and I'm currently serving as Canon Theologian at the Washington National Cathedral, and have been an ordained Episcopal priest for 41 years now. But I am also, of course, a theologian. I've taught at Union Theological Seminary, at Goucher College, at Howard University School of Divinity. My research is in Black theology, womanist theology, the Black faith tradition, particularly as it concerns issues of racial justice and sexuality, and of course, the womanist struggle, Black women's struggle and experience for freedom.
Mhm.
So let us jump right in, Professor Savage, into this conversation by framing the conversation by asking you when we think of this term religious liberty, we tend to think of it as this sort of new term, this new phenomenon reflecting our current social political realities. But it's not. And so let me ask you, what did religious liberty mean as a legal matter in the antebellum period in America?
Excellent question, Reverend Kelly. And if I may call you Reverend Kelly.
Yes, and you may
Um,
call me Kelly. Thank you.
Okay. So when we think about religious liberty and the antebellum period, I want to set the table just a little bit. Religious liberty means a few different concepts rolled into one from a legal standpoint. We think of conscience, the right to believe whatever you want to believe. They give free exercise of religion, of those beliefs. We think about pluralism, allowing different beliefs to exist and coexist together. Think about equality in terms of no belief system being superior to another. Think about separation of church and state, that invisible wall, so-called invisible wall. And part of that also, we think of not having established religion, meaning that all of us in this society, in this country, have to practice one particular form of religion. So we think of that in terms of the First Amendment and what we call RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. But really, as to your point, these concepts come together well before even the nation was founded, and even in Europe, right? And so we look at America being founded by religious dissenters. So this idea of religious liberty is a profound one in that it's lasted for hundreds of years. So with that said, let's go back in time and rewind the video all the way back to the colonial antebellum period. Before 1940s, the Supreme Court even said that religious freedom, First Amendment religion clauses, it only applies to the national government, to federal government, not to states. And that's really important for us to remember that we are a federation of different states, and those states have different religious cultural traditions. So
Mhm.
you think about what you know more than anyone, think about our colonies and the colonial experience, which then turned into states, such as Maryland having a heavy Catholic tradition. You think of Massachusetts having that heavy Puritan tradition. Think of Rhode Island being founded by Roger Williams, having a strong evangelical 18th century evangelical tradition. So with that said, religious liberty meant different things depending on which state that you were living in. But it also meant toleration of religious minorities, such as Catholics, Jews, Muslims, Mormons, even. But it did not mean and never applied to Africans and Black people in the antebellum period. And so with that, I want to think about and have a think about the role of the law at this time.
Yes.
So I'll focus a lot about, I think about the law during the antebellum period on Virginia, just because Virginia having the first encounter of the colonies with Africans in 1619, and then developing probably one of the most robust set of laws regarding slavery. Um, but the law, even in Virginia, allowed for the status of an African person to change from that close to indentured servitude to slavery in just 50 years. So by early 1700s, we already see where Blacks were being devised as not only as something separate and different, but as property. And within that idea of property, the idea was that Christians don't enslave other Christians. And so early on was the idea that if a Black person, if an African were to convert to Christianity, then they would be set free. They would be more akin to the indentured servant or even as a free Black person. Even by within 50 years, 75 years of the Black encounter in America, that changed so that even being a Christian meant that you were not free if you were Black. And so I think about Judge A. Leon Higginbotham's 10 precepts of American slavery jurisprudence. And one of the key precepts is religion and the total and complete control of the slave by controlling the religion and that erasure of that religion for the slave. And so we think of Black people and Africans in this country, or even the colonial period going into the antebellum period, as these objects, right? Because they are defined as chattel property, defined by the law. But they came from a place, they came from a continent, they came from tradition of traditional religious practices. Africanized Christianity, Africanized Islam. So these were people, I'm sure that we'll get to have some questions for you regarding that. But even in that, there was a way to the law to really oppress and tamp down on that and on who the Black person was as a religious being. And they did that through the slave codes. And when we would go through the slave codes, and like again, using Virginia, you'll see that tightening up, that ever tightening of preventing the slave, preventing even a free person to fully express their religious nature, such that they could not worship and listen to worship services by other Black people. They were only allowed to worship white ministers and white pastors outside of the plantation with their white owners. We had plantation owners having to be forced by law to make sure that they were evangelizing and converting and extorting Christianity to their slaves. Slaves were not allowed to bury their own people. So in every expression of a religious person, down to not being able to read or write, even if it was reading and writing the Bible, even if it meant being able to sing songs or to move about freely as a religious person, all of that was wiped away, and it was done systematically and methodically through the law.
So what we really begin to see then is this interplay between the law and religion, and the law, right, and Christianity, with the primary impetus being the protection not of enslaved rights, but the protection, right, of slaveholders' rights, which in fact leads to this question and concern, right, of the role of
That's
of Christianity or in the perpetuation of enslavement.
That's right. And it's a great question I had for you in terms of helping us think through the role of religious institutions at this time and how they were part and parcel of this law that was going on to really oppress and deny religious rights to enslaved and free Black people.
No, that's right. And so I'll reinforce indeed, Professor Savage, some of the things that you've said, but I think if we are to really understand the role of religion, in particular Christianity and churches, in sustaining and sanctioning and legitimating this system of chattel slavery, and of course upholding the rights of the slaveholder as opposed to the enslaved. We have to understand Christianity as a religion, first and foremost in this regard, with a strong missionary impulse. It was a missionary faith. And so it's driven by this notion that salvation can only come through Christ, uh, drawing upon, even if we might say, a misrepresentation of the text that says, "Go thee therefore and baptize in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit." So at its foundation, when we think, first of all, of Christianity with this strong missionary impulse, at its very foundation in this regard is a conflict with any notion of religious liberty when you have a prevailing notion that Christianity is the one true religion and there's no salvation outside of that. And what we began to see early on is this sort of equation, even though there are plurality of religions in the American context, but you began to see early on that this correlation between being an American and being Christian, and between patriotism and the Christian faith tradition. Moreover, this missionary impulse really provides a sacred canopy for the sort of imperialistic and colonizing fervor, right? That sort of emanates, if you will, from the European continent, from England. And so these two things began to go hand in hand. So, for instance, as you emphasized what was going on in Virginia in 1606, King James issues a charter establishing the Virginian Plymouth companies, but in that charter, he specifies that they should be propagating, as he puts it, the Christian religion to people who live in darkness and misery. Now, of course, this initially would refer to indigenous peoples of North America, but of course, then go on to more particularly and more especially apply to those Africans who were captured and enslaved. So now you have set up another conflict which you spoke to that is going to emerge in terms of, well, a notion of religious liberty. Because you, first of all, this missionary impulse means that you have to convert, right? And so it drives the effort to convert and to baptize people, including and especially the African enslaved. And so one of the first justifications now for slavery was this justification that the enslavement saved the Africans from their hedonism, not even recognizing whatever religions they may or may not have been practicing, as well as not even recognizing the versions of Christianity that many Africans were practicing. They believed that they had to be converted to this sort of more what we would call now evangelical notion of Christianity. So they had to convert. They had to convert the dark and miserable African heathen, saving the African heathen from their captivity, if you will, to sin. But now herein lies a problem. If you convert, and you raised this issue, does that mean that you have to free them? Because there's this notion that English common law suggested that once baptized, then you could no longer, that a particular person could no longer be enslaved, that one could not enslave a Christian. And so that Christianity in so many ways freed one from a condition of servitude. And so it was believed that this was a part of English common law, and there was a particular judgment by Justice Mansfield in regard to an enslaved person, Somerset, who was forced onto a ship bound to Jamaica, and an abolitionist that many of us have heard of, Granville Sharp, bought this case and said, no, that, he cannot be forced back into servitude. And in fact, Justice Mansfield ruled that he should be freed. And so this buffered again the notion that in English common law, that one could not at once Christianize and enslave.
Right.
Now, the response to this, and I'll say this quickly, was not that, oh, then we have to free all those that we have baptized. For some, the response was, then we won't baptize. But it wasn't this sort of, okay, we will free those that we have baptized. No. The response was in many colonies to begin to enact laws that made it clear that no, to be baptized is not to be freed. And so you had places like Maryland that in 1663 passed a series of laws, actually between 1663 and 1664, saying that you had, whether you were baptized or not, you remained in the enslaved condition for life. Virginia passed a series of laws from 1667 through 1705, saying the same thing, and all along the way tweaking those in case somebody got confused. And then, of course, we know that in 1727, the Bishop of London, Edmund Gibson, pronounced that the freedom which Christianity promised, and I quote from that, was from the bondage of sin and Satan, but it did not change one's earthly condition. And so what we see immediately now is another, if you will, conflict with this notion of religious liberty or religious freedom, because what is made clear is, one, religious freedom doesn't really mean that you can have any religion you want, because from this Christian vantage point, it meant that if you were to be saved, you had to be Christian. That particularly applied to African persons. The other conflict becomes that religious freedom means that you are free. But no, they begin to say, no, religious freedom means that you are free from sin, but you were not free, as we like to say, free indeed. And so that it became more important to convert an enslaved person than to free an enslaved person. And what we then began to see now is the beginning framework for what some of us call a slaveholders religion, a slave-holding religion that begins to use indeed the biblical witness to justify the enslavement of African peoples, and to legitimate that, in more particular, especially to justify the enslavement of Christians. And to make clear that any notion that there was a law that contravened the understanding that Christians could be slaves, some of them said didn't exist, or that law was confused.
Well, I think you get to there, Kelly, which is great, is a third conflict, which you even teased up a little bit. It's a conflict between what was going on in England and the rest of Europe regarding slavery, and also what's happening in the Americas. And part of the conflict we'll see between England and the colonies is the fact that in England, it's well and good that they can say that you're free because they actually didn't have slavery on their shores. So much so that was actually part of the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson wrote into Declaration of Independence that was taken out, where the charges against King George was that you introduced slavery onto our shores here in America. And so once slavery took root, and once having this class of people who could then labor in a way that they found that they could not do with Native Americans who were already here, indigenous people who were already here, once that took root and the economic reality took root, then that's when we began seeing, to your point, in Maryland, in Virginia, the changing of the law of the slave code, saying just because you become a Christian does not mean that you are free, right? And so I think that's that conflict too, in terms of what was going on in England, what was going on in America. Church and law went hand in hand, so that when slave codes came out listing all the things that plantation owners had to do for slaves and could not do for slaves, allowing them to have religious freedom, that was listed and nailed to the door of the church. So the church was the site for law and for the enactment of law. And when there were promulgations against people, particularly, or even if slaves were to be lashed and or killed, that was announced in the church. So there was this definitely this wedding of church and law and religion during this antebellum time. I think is really important. But I think what you're saying in terms of the reminder that there's a rich tradition of religion held by the slaves, right? We think about, like you said, some slaves were Christian, some were Muslim, some had religious practices. But maybe I would love for you to speak through and tell us just a little bit more about how religious practices and theologies developed amongst enslaved people and free people around this time, and how they were treated by religious authorities.
Yeah, that's a good question, and leads us really into the complex ways in which one can indeed understand Christianity, so that in many respects, while you speak of the Church of England, and it was the case, was sort of the official church of the colonies, you did have various other religious groups. I'll say one word about that before we even talk about the religions that the enslaved brought with them and how that impacted the way in which they began to respond to Christianity. But or even do that, what was interesting is as how you spoke about the different laws and the way those laws were even tacked on to church doors, etc., talking about how one should treat the enslaved. At the same time that these laws are emerging in terms of how one should treat the enslaved, there are also, if you will, catechisms, laws, rules emerging about how one should Christianize the slaves, how one should instruct the slaves in terms of the Bible, how one should preach to the slaves, what were the different texts and scriptures that one should uphold. And so for instance, 1706, Cotton Mather, right, sort of that great evangelical divine, he put out a book called Is the Negro Christianized, right? And of course, in that book, he argued that there was no law that required their freedom. And so he began to, sort of like a catechism, ask and answer various questions, right? So that you would take the soon to be converted enslaved person through this catechism. And so a question may be, if I am baptized, does that mean I'm free? Answer, obviously, no. And so that just as laws were proliferating in terms of the rules of, if you will, enslavement, there were also catechisms or religious instructions proliferating on how to Christianize those that were enslaved. At the same time, one of those laws about which you speak were laws that prohibited not simply teaching the enslaved persons how to read, but also prohibiting them from reading the Bible. Now, that's the irony, right? The irony is that you want to make sure that you Christianize or baptize the enslaved. And one of the reasons that you're driven to do that is because you're motivated by your own sort of theology that suggests that it is that one has to, in fact, one of the reasons for enslavement is bringing them to Christianity. But then you're conflicted because there's this Bible that also has stories of enslaved people being freed, like the Exodus story. Uh, there is this Bible that suggests that there's no Greek or Jew, no slave or free, but all are one in Christ. What do you do with that? Especially, they were especially afraid that the enslaved would find that figure Moses and find right and find the Exodus. So you ban them from reading the Bible. You ban them from learning to read. Again, you ban them from having a Bible in their possession. And people could be whipped and worse for if they were found to have a Bible in their possession. You ban them from any kind of worship by themselves. They can go to worship with their slaveholders, but they cannot hold their own worshiping sort of worship meetings. You ban them from having their own preachers, all of these things. And you say, now, why are they doing that? Because they wanted them to be good Christians.
Right.
Well, because there's this inherent conflict that the slaveholders themselves and those who upheld slaveholding religion that they knew was inherent in the biblical witness. So, as a part of the instructions of how to Christianize the enslaved, there were only certain biblical passages that you were supposed to read to them, sort of like Ephesians, for the slaves to be obedient to their master, or the letter to Philemon, where Paul sends Onesimus back to his slave master after, and here's the catch, after Onesimus had been converted. So here we have, conversion doesn't mean you don't have to be a slave, right? And so much so that they would read these. There's a famous story, of course, that Howard Thurman, great Black theologian and mystic, always tells of his grandmother, where his grandmother, who was enslaved, once she was freed from enslavement, said to Howard Thurman that she didn't want to hear any writings from Paul, because that's all they heard during enslavement, about being free to your master. So the question becomes, and you ask, and I get to now your question in a roundabout way, but I'll use this quickly. What?
Well, Kelly, can I interject just 1 second?
Yeah.
I also want to say that part of the impulse too is not only the idea you're saying in terms of, if we allow slaves to read the Bible, understand the Bible, then they become uppity, right? I read that somewhere. They become uppity and they become notions of freedom, right? Particularly like you mentioned Moses, also the year of Jubilee, right? Every 7 years,
That's right. That's right.
right? But also along with that is the idea of controlling the slave and managing and tamping down on any slave revolt or rebellion. And so that's another reason we see the laws becoming tighter and tighter and tighter, because of that fear, the ever constant fear. Some of it was grounded in reality. There were slave conspiracies, slave revolt conspiracies. We think of very strong ones, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, a lot of other ones in South Carolina and Virginia and in different places, and Harper Ferry. And part of that is, if we allow them to become uppity and get the information from the Bible, then that's even more of a reason for them to revolt. So make sure that you make them be a good slave, and either, like you say, instruct them in the right way, or some plantation owners didn't actually really instruct them in Christianity at all.
Yeah. And that's the irony, right? Professor Savage, that in fact, as strong as this sort of concern was and this missionary impulse was, you really did not have a lot of enslaved persons being converted to Christianity during that period. And you were perfectly correct in saying many slaveholders just did not attend to it and didn't try to convert them at all. Not only because of their fear that it may not make an obedient slave, as others suggested, but also that it took them away from their work and their duties. It just took too much time. Yet also, of course, as you suggested, gave them this attitude that not that they were equal to their slaveholder, but that they were human beings and that they were meant to be free. The other irony, you're right in saying that, particularly as you see these slave revolts that we are most familiar with, even those that were thwarted, Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey. But then by the time you get to Nat Turner in 1831, right, in Virginia, you really began to see these tightening of the laws, especially because Nat Turner used so much biblical imagery.
Right. That's
But
right.
the irony is that there were many slave revolts that were actually not driven by the Bible
That's right.
or by religion, but it only took a few of notable ones for them to even become more wary
Mhm.
of introducing the enslaved population to Christianity, or at least allowing the enslaved population to get a hold of the Bible on their own. So that's always, I would say, the illogic of this
Yes.
notion, and
Absolutely.
continues to strike in contrast to any notion
Mhm.
of religious liberty or freedom. And I'll say something about that as we go on, but let me answer quickly this question of the enslaved and the Africans' religion. I guess the best way for me to sum that up is to say this, that while their enslavers may have introduced them to Christianity, because we know that Christianity existed on the African continent well before these imperialistic missionary and colonizing efforts. But while they may have introduced them to Christianity, what we know is that they did not introduce them to God. There was a complex reality
Mhm.
of African religions and a belief, if you will, that sort of is in the variety and diversity of religious beliefs, what seemed to be common, particularly amongst West African religions, was a belief in this great high God.
Mhm.
And then these other, if you will, lesser gods. But here's the thing that we know in relationship to this great high God. This was a God that Africans knew in freedom, and they knew that God knew them in freedom and therefore did not create them to be anything less than free. They would take this notion,
Mhm.
and this notion would come into conflict, let's say, would serve as a buffer from any notion that they were created to be slaves. They knew that they were created by their great high God to be free. So there was this religious resistance, spiritual resistance, if you will, to slaveholders' religion. And so somehow, making a long story short, even as the Bible was withheld from them, as a scripture in the Bible said, the rocks cried out. Somehow
That's right.
they got hold of the stories in the biblical witness.
Mhm.
And they got hold of the story of the Exodus and Moses. They got hold of the story of Jesus that said, I have come to set the captives free, right? Jesus' first public sermon.
Right.
And they knew that, oh, that Jesus isn't the Jesus painted on the side of slave ships. Again, that Jesus sounds, some of them thought, like one of our lesser gods. That Jesus is related to our great high God. And then, there's Moses. In some respects, they saw Jesus as a second Moses. We know that there was an oral
Mm.
tradition
That's right.
in which they discovered these stories that were withheld from them by their enslavers, and they were compatible
Mhm.
with their African religious traditions that affirmed to them that they were sacred human beings created to be free. And so they would sneak away.
Mm.
Right? In spite of all of the surveillance, they would sneak away, as we say, into the hush harbors or in their cabins at night, and they would hold their own sort of religious ceremonies and their own worship, and they would contrive different means for hiding the sound, if you will, from their enslavers. Some, as we know, one of the common means was to overturn a pot, and they said that it would soak up the sound. It is out of those secreted hush harbor experiences that this Black religious tradition
Mm.
begins to emerge. And at the center of this Black religious tradition is, and I'm going to end here, is another notion, if you will, for this conversation, of religious freedom, another notion of religious liberty.
Mhm.
Because what they are very clear about is that the freedom that is central to Christianity is not simply the freedom of, if you will, the soul from sin, something that one will experience in the afterlife. The freedom that is the freedom of the God of Jesus Christ, they are very clear, is liberation, liberation from the bonds and chains of slavery. And so it's no accident that someone like a Harriet Tubman is driven
Right.
by her Christian faith tradition and always testifies to the God that was with her. And what we have to understand again is that they didn't need their enslavers to tell them about God. And because they had a notion of God, they had a buffer to understanding that they weren't meant to be enslaved, and that allowed them to begin to craft another notion
Mm.
of religious liberty and religious freedom.
Absolutely. I love what you say in terms of enslaved people, enslaved Africans knowing God for themselves. And I think what we see the law trying to do is make God be the white man.
Yeah.
God is the plantation owner. God is a church leader who tells you how to worship. But it's always inherent within enslaved people and free people, to free Black people at this time. They know God for themselves. So despite what the law may say who God is, there is an agency and a power within themselves knowing who God is.
So they held together this notion of religious freedom that it impacted the body, but most significantly, I think, for the law, is that they held together the notion of freedom and justice. So, which brings me to this question for you, Professor Savage. When
Please
did
call me
that get
Audra.
separated?
Yeah, when
In
did
the law, that religious liberty and justice have no relationship, at least as we see it today. This notion of religious freedom and liberty is being used the way in which it was used by slaveholders in the antebellum period as a justification to discriminate. And so when did we see, where did the law, I'm gonna pick on you. Where did the
yeah,
law go all wrong?
I'm asking that myself. I'm looking around asking the question. And first, and definitely, please call me Audra. Let's say, call me Audra, call me Professor Savage, just call me for dinner. Uh, but with that said, where is the liberty and religious liberty? How has it been detached? When did it detach from justice? And I would say that it has never been part of justice.
Mm.
Um, which is what you just told us, right? That as enslaved people had to hold that idea of justice and religious freedom for themselves, because the law and society and policies and government and plantation owners and the economy and all of that never had justice and religious liberty. Even for white people, when we go through the history of religious liberty, talks about just toleration of other religions, minority religions like Mormonism,
Mhm.
like Judaism, like Catholicism, right? So it's, for me, it's always been detached from justice. And I think the way that the Constitution was created, way back when it came about in the late 1700s, um, by the way it was crafted and the way there were provisions to allow slavery and a slave institution to thrive. And that was by no mistake. We think of the Constitutional Convention as the founding fathers coming together and thinking about the Commerce Clause and the judiciary, and that's true too. But what's often left out of this story is slavery was a central debate during the Constitutional Convention.
Yes.
The South came ready and armed, that they were going to protect the peculiar institution at all costs. And the North wasn't really ready for that. And the North capitulated time and time again to the demands, so that when we have this Constitution, we have the Three-Fifths Clause, we have the Fugitive Slave
In
Clause,
the Constitution itself,
in the U.S.
which people
Constitution.
don't understand.
People
Yes,
don't understand. Read the Constitution.
that's right.
Even in law school, I'm like, we have constitutional law. Do we actually read the Constitution? Read the Constitution. Three-Fifths Clause, Slave Importation Clause, not allowing to ban the importation of slaves until 1808.
That's right.
But the word slave was never used in the Constitution, which is why people allow themselves to be confused. Some people are confused. Some people allow themselves to be confused because slavery is never named, because when it's said in, you look through the historical record, it would, owing to the sensitivities of those in the North. So they're perfectly allowed and perfectly fine with allowing slavery to be protected in the Constitution, as long as you didn't say that's what you were doing. And we see that in America a lot of times, right? As long as you say one thing and do something else.
You can be racist and never talk about race.
And never talk about race. And we can't talk about race now, goodness forbid that we actually learn our history.
Right.
And so by creating the Constitution in that the way the founders did, it meant that in the way the Supreme Court actually adjudicated cases, it meant that you could be human and African, but not in America. That was part of Amistad's holding. That all states became slave captors, right? Fugitive Slave Clause, also the Fugitive Slave Acts. Even if states that were very abolitionist bent, like Pennsylvania, for instance, you are now slave captors returning slaves. Slaves are property, chattel property, and that there's even words by the Supreme Court during the Antebellum period in some cases saying that the compromises on slavery made by the founding fathers into the Constitution are sacred compromises, because without those compromises, the country would not have been formed. And of course, the dreaded Dred Scott, saying that Black people of all stripes are not citizens at all, not deemed worthy. So this created, and because we had a part parcel of that, right, this Christianity supporting this idea, this othering of Black people, then what we have is civil religion, and I would say built on racism.
That's right.
Right. And that's what that means then and now is the othering. And civil religion, that means for us the way a society organizes itself with principles. And what it says from the Constitution through antebellum period until now is that Blackness is profane and whiteness is sacred. It means that Black people are less than. It means that Black people don't have the agency, and for our conversation, don't have the agency for religious freedom. And so that's that through line back from the Constitution making and through the antebellum period, which lasted, many decades before the bloodiest of wars. Supposedly it did end slavery, but we see that it twisted the slavery to something else, which we still contend with today. But this time of having this such a strong document as a Constitution, right? This vaulted Constitution saying that Black people are less than and do not have freedom, let alone religious freedom, to express who they are.
Oh my goodness. You've said so much there. That is indeed fundamental to what it means, right, to be an American in this society. It is embedded, this notion of white supremacy, if you will, and anti-Blackness is embedded within the very fabric of America's identity. And as that is the case, there has always been a sacred canopy, if you will, to legitimate that. There has always been a narrative, a religious narrative that indeed legitimates America's very white supremacist, anti-Black understanding of itself. And this we can call a civil religion, because a civil religion, as Robert Bellah told us some time ago, has its own saints, has its own heroes, right? And these are the founding fathers. These become the heroes. It has its own holidays, its own religious holidays, like the 4th of July, right? Like Thanksgiving. So it has its own rituals. It has its own symbols that you cannot profane, i.e., the flag. And so right? And so what American civil religion in effect is a sacred canopy over America's understanding of itself. And America's understanding of itself and what it means to be an American has always been reflective of the dominant cultural class and group, right? Again, so it has always, from its inception, America's ideal of what it means to be a good American has always, from its very inception, been a patriarchally, heterosexist, racist, classist notion
Right.
of who is a full American citizen. Again, so what we see when we talk today about sort of these manifestations, if you will, of white Christian nationalism is that it is the legacy of sort of this notion of American civil religion that emerged as America emerged and began to identify what it meant to be an American. These contradictions, as you have just pointed out, are embedded in our constitutional realities.
They
They
are
are
our DNA. They are, as a
they're in
country,
our DNA.
it's who
Right.
we are. It's our genetic code.
That's exactly right. And there has always been, it cannot be said enough, a religion in the name of Christianity, typically, that has justified that. Yet, even as I say that, there's also always been the resistance to that narrative. For the most part, that resistance has emerged from those who have been oppressed by this slaveholding, sacred canopy legitimization of white supremacy narrative. But we also must say, for those who sometimes look back at history and try to excuse the overt white supremacist realities of white Christians and anti-Black realities of white Christians during that time. There are those who try to excuse it by saying, well, that's the way everybody was. You can't hold them accountable to that, because how would they know any different? Well, you know what? There were white Christians who knew different.
Right.
Right? There was it may not have been the prevailing narrative of the time, but there was a narrative of white Christians who understood that Christianity and slavery did not belong together, and that Christianity meant freedom. So there is
Mhm.
a white religious Christian tradition, if you will, of abolitionists that began to support the abolition of slavery, understanding that embedded within the Christian tradition is an anathema to slavery itself. Yet,
Yeah.
even as I say that,
Mm.
Audra, they too, many of those early Christian abolitionists, believed in the abolition of slavery and thought it was a sin.
Mhm.
but couldn't find themselves believing in the equality.
Well, I was just going to say that, Kelly. I was
That's
even
right.
in abolitionism
That's right.
early on to the end of slavery, there was a split sometimes between Black abolitionists and white abolitionists, precisely
That's
because
right.
the idea of equality. It's one thing to allow people to be in chains and treated as property, right? Even a founding father, I forget which one, when during the Constitutional Convention, telling, arguing against the three-fifths notion of a slave being a person, because, well, why we don't give rights to chairs and to horses, why give it to slaves, right? This idea that even though Africans and Black people are people and are not property, it does not mean they should be in society with us.
That's
It does
right.
not mean that they're equal to be with us, right? So yes, free them and then send them back to Africa.
That's
Uh,
right.
right.
That's
So
right.
even within the notion of abolitionism, there's the idea of abolitionism and freedom doesn't always mean equality.
That's
And it
right.
goes back to your question about justice.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And what you see, the prevailing sort of narrative that emerges during the antebellum period, for which, as you have pointed out, that legacy continues. This prevailing notion uh, is to protect the master class and right in any way possible. When we're talking about the Great Awakenings, where some have said that this is the period where we began to see more Black people becoming Christians, and that really it was the number of Black people who were Christians or Christianized during the antebellum period, many have said was nominal. Uh, and and I like to say it may have been nominal. We don't know what the actual numbers were, but we do know that a Black faith tradition began to emerge, a dominant Black faith tradition began to emerge out of that antebellum period, regardless of how small the number of enslaved Christians there were. But some say that more were Christianized during the Great Awakenings, and that what attracted them to this sort of Great Awakening fervor was one that the the fervor of it and sort of revival fervor, but the notion of freedom, and that uh, these Great Awakening preachers, particularly in the Second Great Awakening with the revivals, would often talk about the promise of freedom. In that promise of freedom, though, from the evangelist point of view, it was about freedom in heaven, not freedom in earth. And so you begin to really see this body-soul split taking place. But the Black converts were attracted to the
Mhm.
notion of freedom and the notion that to be a Christian, we are all equal. That in Christ there's no East nor West, no Greek or Jew, no slave or free. What do we sometimes see this, as you said, this relationship between Christianity and the law? What's
Mhm.
going on during this period of the Great Awakenings when you're beginning to see even more Black people come into Christianity and be stirred by the notion of freedom?
Yeah, I think around this time, like talking about Kelly, we're looking at something we mentioned earlier, the tightening of slave codes, the tightening of the law to repress the not only religious freedom, but also any freedom of slaves, right? Because the population of slaves is growing to the fact that it's fueling the economy of the country.
That's right.
Right? And so there's got to be a way to control that, particularly have more and more slaves being born. Um, so we look at the tightening of those laws, and at the same time, now you have the enter the Great Awakening, especially like you said, the Second Great Awakening, which you have these religionists, these revivalists coming in and saying, no, no, not only Black person and slaves do you have a soul, that you have a Holy Ghost that can be set free, but also we want to worship with you. Right. And remember at the time that we had a slave code saying very clearly, now the law says one thing, We all know practice is something different, society is something different. But we have slave codes saying that there should be no interracial mixing in terms of worshiping and worship services. If anything, a white slave owner may bring the slave to hear a white preacher or a white worship service, but that's it. But the idea that you have these revivalists now as part of this Great Awakening coming in and wanting to include enslaved people in worship service and train them so they can worship and exhort and convert their own kind was revolutionary in that it allowed more agency at a time when the law is denying ever more freedom and
Mm-hmm.
agency of an enslaved person. So as a law was tightening, now you have this religious expression that's freeing and loosening. And we know, speaking of, we talked about a little bit about the internal hypocrisy that we
Yes.
continue to see from the very beginning of our nation's founding, even within the Great Awakening, even when these religious traditions, right? And we wanted to include Black people. Part of that was a pure on just rebellion against the established religion of be it Anglicanism or whatever religion it was at the time, whatever state it was in. But that was a way to rebel against it and saying, we don't need you, your formalized religion. We have this free expression, and we can include slaves and even women too. And so that was, I see that as slaves and enslaved people, even free Black people, being used as a tool again by these religionists. Even some in the Great Awakening, they very clearly, explicitly had the statements against slavery, but they themselves, I guess, even Quakers, would own slaves.
They own slaves.
Right. Right. And so it's always that internal struggle that's going on. And at the same time as well, we had the Supreme Court leading up into we know the Civil War with their cases again saying that slaves are people, are not people, sorry, slaves are property, and they're not citizens. So the more the law was just really strangling any sense of agency or freedom of a Black person, they have a freedom in terms of religious expression.
Yeah, I guess that's the theme here. Uh, right? These inherent contradictions. The question becomes, how do you live in these contradictions? How does one adjudicate these contradictions? One can do that by limiting what one knows about the Constitution, about history, et cetera, so that you can protect people from seeing the contradiction, the masses from recognizing the contradiction. And you see that, of course, that tradition within Christianity itself, as we have talked about. The other sort of running theme here is that even for those who knew it was wrong, they still could not free themselves from their own whiteness, if you will, the privileges that they received from living within a context that was defined by white supremacy. And those privileges were privilege of ownership. And in this instance, ownership of property. In this instance, ownership of human property. And so because one of the ways in which people got around even thinking that there was a contradiction between enslaving other human beings was saying, well, but these people, they aren't human. They're chattel. And so we aren't enslaving other human beings. This is our property. And so we had all kind of property laws, right? That were really meant to protect the human property of the enslavers. Well, the same we see in terms of those within the Christian tradition who believed that slavery itself was wrong, but they could not free themselves from white supremacist notions that gave them the right to own the other human beings. And so we see someone like a great English great awakening evangelist George Whitefield. I mean, he owned slaves.
Right. And just right there, the contradictions, right?
Right there.
They just, even within the Great Awakening and these leaders, just the I had a mentor say the more, at least in the Great Awakening, the more that, the Methodist tradition and Baptist tradition became more institutionalized and more formalized, then the less the rhetoric changed, or the more the rhetoric changed to the freedom of the soul, not of the body,
Yeah.
right? So we see it. So it was this great, like, rebellious religious experience coming through the Great Awakening. And then by the end of it, they're not saying anything that's too much different than what the established faith was saying beforehand.
Well, and the more religion becomes institutionalized, the more these religious institutions become social institutions, right? And and and
And
so
the white supremacy and the hierarchy, the against replicate itself yet again.
That's right. And so the sacred canopy looks a little bit different now. It's institutionalized sacred canopy. Again, that's why you began to see, of course, particularly during the period of the Civil War, denominations splitting. Uh, right. So you have the Methodist split, the Presbyterian split over the issue of slavery, not over the issue of equality, but I mean, we always must be clear about this,
Right.
but over the issue of slavery, and it is this issue of equality that becomes, of course, the catalyst for the African Methodist Episcopal Church, with Richard Allen emerging as they were members of St. George's White Methodist Church, and he and Absalom Jones, the first Black Episcopal priest, would bring more Black people into the church by their preaching and their presence. And it's like, oh no, the other congregation members were offended by that they have to really sit next to these people in church. Again, so they were removed from their pews and told to go up into the balcony. And there are all kind of course, terms that are used for that balcony where Black people were relegated to sit. We see in some of our older churches, those choir lofts were actually spaces in which Black people were forced to worship and sit separate from white people. So although they welcomed them into the church, they didn't welcome them as equal members
Right.
into the church. And as the church, just as you said, became even more institutionalized, you began to really see this whole notion of welcome yet not equal.
You think about the through line and how our early history, or this DNA, this genetic code of white supremacy through religion, how it plays out today. I'm not only am I a lawyer, but I'm also a law professor. And I've been a lawyer for 20 years, graduated 20 years ago from my beloved Columbia Law School. Um, and then, and even now, in our curriculum for property, there's no discussion of the property of human chattel,
Yes.
right? Slavery formed a lot of our principles of property. We reify property, right? It's property and free speech in this country, two fundamental legal concepts that we have that every American understands. But never in law school, where we're training people to think like lawyers and to be lawyers, do we ever actually talk about the first and most important property in early American history, and that being the human property. So again, that not even erasure, right? The idea we mentioned with the Constitution of allowing slavery, but not ever calling it by name in the Constitution, even allowing this idea of property, but not calling it out by name, which is human property. And we continue to see that through and through and through. And so thinking now about religious liberty and thinking about how we conceptualize it in the law, at least right now, I'm reminded of something another mentor always said to me when discussing religious liberty: old things get deference.
Mm.
So the Supreme Court is happy to allow, for instance, Christmas displays that are purely Christian Christmas displays if the town, if a city, municipality has been doing it for decades, allowing the hanging of the Ten Commandments, if it's been there for decades. Not right now, you can't do it now, but if it was already there, then so be it. Bladensburg, Maryland, the large Christian cross.
That's
Well, it's
right.
been there for a long time. And so it's more suspect of new symbols of religiosity. But if it was old, then it gets that deference. And we're seeing in the past 10 years or so with Supreme Court cases looking at religious liberty in this country, and mostly adjudicated through the Religious Freedom Restoration Act or a backdoor through freedom of speech and not the religion clauses of the First Amendment. We see this expression of the history and tradition. We have to allow the history and tradition, and that'll guide our religious liberty adjudication, so that a coach can pray on a field after a high school game, even though there's still people around, but the game is technically over, and therefore his duty as a person who's affiliated with the school is over. Old things get deference. And what I find missing is what do we include in those old things? What is that history and understanding? In our discussion for the past hour or so, Kelly has shown that we know the history and tradition when it comes to religious freedom or the lack thereof for African descendants. But the query is the court seeing that? When they talk about religious liberty, are they seeing the othering that was done as part of that religious expression in Antebellum America? And I fear that it's not, because now we have in the Supreme Court cases dealing with religious liberty for the past 10 years or so, it's part of this cultural war of evangelical Christians, dare I say, driven mostly by white Christian nationalism, against the LGBT community, and particularly the expression of same-sex marriage.
That's right.
Right. And so this idea, again, we love this, the through line, right? But this through line of always having this othering and allowing whose religion is valued, whose religious expression is valued, and whose is not.
There has always been a narrative of resistance to a dominant Christian tradition which legitimates oppression. There has always been that.
Mm-hmm.
The question becomes, what tradition do our laws uphold? What tradition, as the Supreme Court decisions in regarding religious liberty, which Christian tradition are they upholding? Again, the tradition that they are upholding is the tradition that has always been compatible with a white gaze, that has always been compatible with a white knowing. And so it is no accident, right, that you would then see cases which allow for the religious freedom that is allowed to pray after a football game, or to have a cross in the middle of a public square if it's been there all along. Well, why has it been there all along, and who put it there, and what was it representing all along? And what does it represent now? Well, it looks like white Christian nationalism to me, and it doesn't look like religious freedom. No respect for the religious freedoms of those who are not raced white, and whose religion doesn't signify to what it means to be raced white. And I want to ask you this as a legal scholar, and when you think of the notion of religious liberty, what is your hope for the future of religious liberty?
That's a great question. Kelly, my hope for religious liberty is that the Supreme Court takes a hard look at its jurisprudence, its reliance on history and tradition, and think about, again, whose history, whose tradition, or I like to say more history, less tradition. No more of the history of what we're talking about when it comes to America, it comes to religious freedom, and less of that tradition of othering and oppressing and enslaving the other, and now allowing a full expression of that religious freedom. So more history and less tradition by the Supreme Court. And I would love for more conversations about religious liberty to be included in our discussions of justice, for those of us who are advocates for racial justice, particularly advocates against anti-Black racism, to think about the role of religion in that as well, and think about religious liberty as a leg of the full picture of justice. let us put the liberty back in religious liberty.
Audra, if I were to answer that question for myself in terms of the hope for the future of religious liberty, I think about it this way, and these discussions have made me think more about it. And that is when we say religion or what it means to be religious, I often say it means that whatever your religion may be, that you have asked and answered a question, and maybe several times throughout your life's journey. And that is there more to life than this? Is there more than this sort of ephemeral, capricious reality? Is there more to justice than this? Is there more to freedom than this? The religious response is yes, there is more. And so to be religious is to hold oneself accountable to the more. The more, in my religious language, that is divine freedom. The more that is divine justice. The more that the enslaved who never ever breathed a free breath, never dreamt that they would breathe a free breath. Yet they fought for freedom anyhow, because they fought for the freedom that they knew was the justice of God. That's religious liberty. And so my hope for the future of religious liberty is that we would fight for the more. That is the just future that God promises us all, to be free from all that would encumber us from living into the fullness of our sacred humanity. That, to me, is religious liberty. And so, Audra, thank you
Thank you,
for what
Canon.
has been a wonderful conversation. Every time I
Yes.
talk with you, I learn so much. And so I am sure that everyone that is listening has learned so much. And if nothing else, whether they walk away with the right answers, it is my hope that those who listen in to this conversation will at least walk away with a different set of questions. I thank you for the conversation, and I thank you all for watching.